Chapter 5. This tide of antagonistic sentiment which swept over the free Negroes gave acceleration to a movement that brought upon those in New York and other cities in the North a struggle second in importance to the struggle against slavery. That movement was the colonization of free Negroes. Colonization was not a new idea. It had for some time been considered by philanthropic people as a plan for helping the blacks who were free. Certain of the Quakers put it into effect on a small scale by purchasing lands on which to settle their manumitted slaves in communities of their own. It grew from the plan for isolated Negro communities to that of a settlement in a territory set apart in the western section of the country, then to colonization in the West Indies. A number of prominent people suggested Africa. In 1811, Thomas Jefferson strongly endorsed the idea of African colonization. But African colonization got little further than an expression of ideas until action was taken by a Negro. He was Paul Cuffee, a freeman of color of New Bedford, Massachusetts. Cuffee was a sailor who finally became master of his own ship, and who in his career saw a good part of the world. He also made money. When he died, he left an estate of $20,000. He was converted to colonization and in 1815 transported in his own ship 9 Negro families, 38 persons, to the west coast of Africa at a cost of $4,000, all of which he bore. Cuffee's undertaking attracted the attention of the country and caused ideas about colonization to take on definite form. In December 1816, a meeting of those interested in colonization was called in Washington, and an organization was formed to be known as the American Society for Colonizing Free People of Color of the United States. Henry Clay, then Speaker of the House of Representatives, presided at the meeting. The Colonization Society approached the government for support, and in 1819, Congress, upon a recommendation from President Monroe, passed a bill appropriating $100,000 that could be used for the purposes of the society. This cooperation between the government and the Colonization Society resulted in the establishment of the colony of Liberia on the west coast of Africa. Liberia in 1847 became an independent Negro republic, with the seat of government at Monrovia, named in honor of President Monroe. From its inception, the Colonization Society was an amalgam of diverse ideas and ideals. It was all things to all men. It furnishes the only instance in American history in which groups holding conflicting opinions on the polymorphous Negro question united for a common end, and, stranger still, each group felt that it was realizing its intention. The common end was the transporting of the free Negroes out of the United States. Working side by side were those who were moved by a sincere desire to ameliorate the Negro's condition, those who wished only to rid themselves of all moral and social responsibility for a troublesome situation, and those who were determined to banish forever what they considered a threat to the security of the slave system. The only group interested in the Negro not to affiliate was the abolitionist group, and at no time did the Colonization Society attack slavery, even in the mildest manner. The efforts of the society, so far as its main object was concerned, were futile. The organization increased rapidly in membership and wealth, and branches were established in northern and southern states, but the results of its work to get free Negroes out of the country were less than negligible. In 13 years after the first shipment in 1820, only 2,885 emigrants had been sent to Liberia, nor could any amelioration of the condition of the race be noted. On the contrary, the efforts of the society had a disastrous effect. The propaganda that it spread emphasized the utter hopelessness, despair, and defeat for the Negro in America. It declared that he could never become an enlightened and useful citizen of the United States, and that his only hope for opportunity and development lay in the establishment of a country for him in Africa. It will be noted as we go further that this was the identical doctrine and argument of Garvey in the Back to Africa movement 100 years later. Nor did the propaganda stop at this point. It was often direct vilification of the free Negroes. It was at the 10th annual meeting of the society that Henry Clay expressed his opinion of free colored people, quoted on a previous page. The Denmark Vesey and Nat Turner insurrections brought added strength and wealth to the Colonization Society and gave it grounds for doubling and redoubling its efforts. Nevertheless, emigration to Liberia languished. In the 20 years from 1833 to 1853, the organization, with all the influence and money it had behind it, sent out less than 4,000 settlers. The fundamental reason for the failure of the colonization scheme was a very patent one. It was simply that the free Negroes would not go to Africa. They not only refused to go, they fought the plans of the Colonization Society from the start. In fact, the first National Convention of Negroes held in the United States met in Philadelphia in 1831 for the express purpose of opposing, quote, the operations and misrepresentations of the American Colonization Society in these United States, end quote. The convention, speaking on behalf of the free Negroes of the country, stated that the inevitable tendency of the society's doctrine was to strengthen their enemies and retard the free Negroes' advancement in morals, literature, and science. In short, to extinguish the last glimmer of hope and throw an impenetrable gloom over their former and more reasonable prospects. In 1834, the meeting was held in New York. At the beginning of the second half of the 19th century, there was a recrudescence of agitation for colonization, and at this time a number of free Negroes in northern cities, disheartened by unyielding pressure, came out in favor of emigration. Some of them advocated Africa, some Central America, and others Haiti. The advocates of Haiti eventually succeeded in taking about 2,000 settlers to the Black Republic, but the big majority of the northern leaders continued to oppose the whole idea. The New York group, led by Frederick Douglass, fought it with all their might. Douglass ridiculed it, saying that before a ship could make the return trip, there would be 10 shiploads of new babies waiting on the dock. The Negroes in New York not only had to bear the pressure of general sentiment against free Negroes, but were called on to stand up under an economic pressure stronger than that endured by any other of the free groups. For generations, the New York Negroes had had an almost uncontested field in many of the gainful occupations. They were domestic servants, laborers, bootblacks, chimney sweeps, whitewashers, barbers, hotel waiters, cooks, sailors, stevedores, seamstresses, ladies' hairdressers, janitors, caterers, coachmen. At that time, a black coachman was almost as sure a guarantee of aristocracy for a northern white family as a black mammy for a family of the South. In a limited way, they were engaged in the skilled trades. The United States Census of 1850 lists New York Negroes in 14 trades. in two occupations, as janitors of business buildings and as caterers. A number of individuals actually grew wealthy. At one time, the best food that could be procured in New York City was that furnished by colored caterers. In the decade 1830-1840, a favorite resort for bankers, brokers, and merchants was a restaurant kept by a colored man, Thomas Downing, on Broad Street near Wall. He made a fortune. In that same period, the most exclusive parties and most fashionable weddings were served by a colored caterer, Thomas Jackson. Jackson in his day was the arbiter of New York in things gustatory. Fraunces Tavern at Broad and Pearl Streets, now one of the great historic landmarks in New York City, was for many generations the most famous tavern in New York. It was established by Samuel Fraunces, a colored man from an island of the French West Indies, familiarly known as Black Sam. Fraunces bought the property in 1762 for £2,000. It was at Fraunces Tavern that the body known as the New York Chamber of Commerce was organized. In 1768, the inn was frequented by General Washington, and it was there that he bade farewell to his officers on December 4th, 1783. The farewell dinner was tendered by Governor Clinton. It was a dinner that was well washed down. The bill rendered by Fraunces to Governor Clinton for liquors amounting to £97, 12 shillings. Fraunces personally conducted the tavern for a number of years. He was well known and well liked by the most prominent New York citizens of his day. His daughter, Phoebe, was Washington's housekeeper at the mansion which the commander-in-chief occupied as headquarters in New York in 1776. When Washington became president, he made Fraunces steward of what was then the White House in New York, located at number 3 Cherry Street. He remained in Washington's employ in New York and in Philadelphia until 1796 or later, as shown by receipts signed by Fraunces, one of which is now on exhibition at the tavern. Fraunces Tavern was purchased and restored as a memorial in 1905 by the Sons of the Revolution. The New York Negroes as a class were industrious and thrifty and were making economic gains. Then began the wave of foreign immigration, which continued to swell until economically it all but submerged them. In the 10 years prior to 1830, less than 130,000 immigrants entered the United States. In the 15 years between 1830 and 1845, nearly 1 million entered. In the 15 years between 1845 and 1860, there were nearly 4 million. Foreign immigration bore down particularly hard on the New York Negro because so large a proportion of the immigrants came into the port of New York and remained there. The struggle was waged chiefly in the wider fields of domestic service, common labor, and the so-called menial jobs. Gradually but steadily, the Negro lost ground. There is, however, an interesting instance of survival that merits mention. In 1825, 2 Negroes set up the firm of Jackson and Smith chimney sweeps. The firm has come down through 3 generations and exists today as George Smith & Son, specialists on defective chimneys and experts on chimney construction and ventilation. At the beginning of the second half of the last century, the condition of the New York Negro was in many ways at its worst. And this aggressive group felt keenly the sentiment, the acts, the humiliations, and insults that they had to contend against. In the middle of the last century, Negroes were not allowed to ride in the streetcars in New York, except in certain cars bearing a sign that ran along their length. Colored people allowed in this car. This particular humiliation was brought to an end in 1854 by a courageous colored woman, a teacher in one of the Negro public schools, who, on being ordered out of a car, clung to her seat until she was dragged out. She took her case into the courts and, with Chester A. Arthur as one of her lawyers, won it. And so, against the New York Negro, out of the fierce economic struggle in which he was forced to engage in the face of great odds, came a new antagonism, the antagonism of those who were competing with him for bread, and which later was to manifest itself in a bloody riot. Chapter 6. The United States Supreme Court in 1857 handed down the momentous Dred Scott decision, the culmination of all the legal devices of the pro-slavery forces to make the slave system secure and permanent. Dred Scott was a slave in Missouri, whose master had on several occasions taken him into free territory. Back in Missouri, Scott brought suit to gain his liberty on the ground that he had lost his status as a slave through his residence in territory where slavery was prohibited. After nearly 10 years of litigation, his case reached the Supreme Court and was there decided. The decision, which was rendered by Chief Justice Taney, not only settled the issue raised by Scott, but went far beyond and attempted to make every foot of American soil safe for the slaveholder. It opened up the vast western section to slavery by declaring that Congress had no constitutional authority to abolish slavery in the territories. And it dealt a direct and staggering blow to the free colored people by laying down the brazen and ruthless doctrine that the Negro, quote, had no rights which the white man was bound to respect, end quote. The Dred Scott decision proved to be the beginning of the end of slavery. History-changing events followed in portentous succession. In 1859, John Brown was at Harper's Ferry. In 1860, Abraham Lincoln was nominated by the newly organized Republican Party. In 1861, Fort Sumter was fired upon, and the irrepressible conflict, so many times a prophecy in the orations of William H. Seward, became a reality. Again, the Negroes of New York were thrown directly into the vortex of a national convulsion. Above all northern cities, New York was the Mecca of the Southern planters. To go to Philadelphia or Boston might never enter their minds, but they came frequently and in large numbers to New York. At the outbreak of the Civil War, Southern slaveholding interests owed the merchants of New York something like $200 million, a sum which the business interest of the city had no desire of losing, even for the most patriotic end. These were two of the reasons why pro-slavery sentiment was strong in New York City. But the Negroes of New York hailed the war, and the leaders redoubled their efforts against slavery. They began immediately to importune the government for the right and chance to do their share of the fighting. Frederick Douglass centered his energies on this objective. At the beginning of the war, however, the administration at Washington and the Union commanders in the field feared the proposal, and general sentiment in the North was opposed to it. But certain Federal generals in the field began utilizing Negroes. In May 1862, Colonel Thomas Wentworth Higginson was organizing and drilling a regiment of former slaves in South Carolina. In the fall of 1862, General Butler organized a Negro regiment in Louisiana. The formation of other units followed, and before the end of 1862, 4 Negro regiments were on the fighting line. But it was not until after the issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation that Lincoln authorized the raising of Negro troops, and the Negroes of the North were given the chance for which they had long been clamoring. When the Negro troops regularly entered the Union armies, they were badly needed. The fortunes of war had swayed back and forth. The initial enthusiasm and confidence of the North had perceptibly waned. The realization had come that the struggle would be long and hard. Grant had captured Fort Donelson. Lee had been held at Antietam, but the Union had not yet gained a decisive victory. Gettysburg and Vicksburg were in the unknown future, and the final outcome was still in doubt. Volunteering had ceased to be spontaneous, and the government had been driven to conscription. Immediately following the proclamation, January 1st, 1863, Negro volunteers rushed into the army. Their first regiment was the 54th Massachusetts, organized February 9th, 1863. In all, 161 regiments of Negro troops, approximately 180,000 men, fought in the Civil War. These forces included 141 regiments of infantry, 7 of cavalry, 12 of heavy, and 1 of light artillery. New York furnished 4 of these regiments. The enlistment of colored soldiers had a decided effect on the Negro and the nation. More and more, as the war went on, the truth emerged that under the ostensible issue of preserving the Union was the fundamental issue of abolishing slavery. White men who were happy to fight and die to the slogan, "Save the Union," were not so moved to sacrifice by the task of freeing the slaves. But sentiment for the Negro and his cause was strengthened by the fact that black men were fighting and dying both to save the Union and to free the slaves. And by the same fact, new strength and dignity were given to the Negro leaders in the North. They were given an unshakable foundation on which to base further demands, and further demands they continued to make. For while the colored people as a whole may have felt that with emancipation and the war won by the Union, their racial troubles would be at an end, many of the leaders were wise enough to foresee that there would be questions still unsettled and dangers still existent. In October 1864, a national convention of colored men met in Syracuse, New York, and for 4 days discussed these questions and dangers. Frederick Douglass, who presided, was emphatic in pointing out that the proclamation was a war measure and might not be regarded as a legal abolishment of slavery when civil authority was restored. In fact, slavery was not actually abolished until the 13th Amendment to the Constitution was adopted. The leaders were sustained in their demands by the manner in which the Negro troops acquitted themselves. Before the end of the war, "The colored troops fought nobly" became a much-quoted phrase. They took part in a number of important battles and made an impression on the general of the armies of the Union, which that most taciturn man gave expression to in a commendation during the skirmishes around Richmond. Negro troops under General Burnside had mined a Confederate fort, and the general wished to give them the lead in the charge that was planned to follow the explosion. The distinction was finally given to white troops. On the failure of the enterprise, General Grant commented, "General Burnside wanted to put his colored division in front. I believe if he had done so, it would have succeeded." Conscription was nowhere popular, but in New York City, it was met with open hostility and violence. For 4 days in July 1863, the draft riots raged, and the city was in the hands of a mob against which the police were powerless. After demolishing draft headquarters, the mob proceeded to wreak vengeance upon Negroes wherever found. They were chased and beaten and killed, hanged to trees and lamp posts. Thousands fled the city, hiding themselves on the outskirts of the city, in the swamps and woods, back of Bergen, New Jersey, at Weeksville, and in the barns and outhouses of the farmers of Long Island and Morrisania. And hundreds sought refuge in the police stations. A historian of the time gives this description: "The sight of one in the streets would call forth a halloo as when a fox breaks cover, and away would dash a crowd of men in pursuit. At one time there lay at the corner of 27th Street and 7th Avenue the dead body of a Negro, stripped nearly naked, and around it a collection of Irishmen, dancing or shouting like wild Indians. The hunt for these poor creatures became so fearful, and the impossibility to protect them in their scattered localities so apparent, that they were received into the police stations. But this soon proved inadequate, and they were taken to the arsenal where they could be protected against the mob. Here the poor creatures were gathered by hundreds and slept on the floor, and were regularly fed by the authorities." Footnote: JT Hadley, The Great Riots of New York City. End of footnote. The Colored Orphan Asylum accompanied a block on 5th Avenue between 43rd and 44th Streets. More than 200 children were housed there in a wooden building 4 stories high. The insatiate mob marched against this institution. The superintendent and matrons, who had been watching through hours of terror, hastily led the inmates out by the rear as the mob entered through the front. In a few moments the building was in flames. The children, at first quartered in the police stations, were finally gathered up, and with a strong guard of police at the front and rear, and a detachment of soldiers on either side, they toddled down to the foot of East 35th Street and were taken aboard ferry boats to Blackwell's Island, where they were given a refuge. In the draft riots, more than 1,000 persons were killed and wounded, and something like $1 million worth of property was destroyed. The reaction from the draft riots was a flood of kindly feelings toward the Negro and of indignation against the mob. Within a few months, a regiment of Negro troops, raised and equipped by the Union League Club, marched down Broadway on their way to the front, escorted by leading citizens and cheered by thousands that lined the sidewalks. After the close of the war, the arena for the Negro shifted from the North to the South. The freedmen, rather than the freedmen of color, came to be the center of discussion and the object of action. The controversies in Congress and throughout the country surged round the war amendments to the Constitution, Reconstruction, and the Civil Rights Bills, with the 4 million ex-slaves as the center of the storm. Their status and future became the chief concern of the nation, so far as it was concerned with the Negro. The Negroes of the North dropped into a place of insignificance from which they did not completely emerge until the United States entered the World War. Large numbers of educated northern Negroes joined the carpetbag migration to the South and played an important part in political leadership and the social advancement of the freemen. Many of the first teachers in schools for Negro children established in the South were educated colored women from the North. In the rapid progress of the former slaves, at emancipation illiterate, penniless, and homeless, the work of the northern Negroes who went south was a vital force. A pause now set in upon the racial activities of the Negroes of the North. They had been among the chief agitators for freedom. They in themselves had been the greatest argument that the Negro should be free. They had stood upon the vantage ground from which they could render aid to their brothers in bondage. Now the slaves were free. They had been made citizens and given the ballot and were exercising political power. The whole scene and the spotlight had shifted down to Washington and below the Potomac. Othello's occupation was gone. It was years before the Negroes in the North fully realized that the close of the Civil War marked only the first great step in the Negroes' fight for complete freedom, and that they again would have to take the lead. This hiatus was particularly marked in New York. For nearly 50 years, this city had been the principal center of the free Negro radicals. It was the stage on which most of the brilliant and powerful Negro leaders had played their parts. It was to New York City that Frederick Douglass first came when he escaped from slavery in 1838. And it was in his adopted state of New York that he rose to world fame and the unquestioned leadership of his race. It is probable that the migration of Frederick Douglass, as the colored people loved to call him, had something to do with the lethargic state that settled upon New York. At the close of the Civil War, Douglass had achieved a greatness in world affairs paralleled in modern history by only one other man of African blood, Toussaint Louverture. Not yet 50, he was a tall, straight, magnificent man, with a leonine head covered with a mass of hair, which later became a glistening white mane. In ability and appearance, he was a leader of men. His name was known in every civilized country. Douglass, the escaped slave, was the incarnation of all the arguments against slavery. For 25 years as agitator, editor, organizer, counselor, eloquent advocate, and fearless champion, he had worked for freedom and equality for his race. He had been the associate of all the great abolitionists and the friend and advisor of Lincoln. From its beginning, he had been a force in the women's suffrage movement, realizing that it was a kindred cause to Negro freedom. He had been a confidant and helper of John Brown. Papers found on John Brown when he was captured at Harper's Ferry involved Douglass, and the black leader fled to Canada, thence to England, just in time to avoid arrest under a requisition issued by Governor Wise of Virginia. He returned the following year and supported Lincoln for the presidency. It is not difficult to conclude that his absence from the state caused a gap in the civic life of the Negro in New York. Douglass went to Washington to live, but retained his New York citizenship. In 1872, he was named elector at large on the presidential ticket by the Republican Party in New York, and upon Grant's election was chosen to take the electoral vote of the state to Washington. It was also in 1872 that the convention of the Equal Rights Party met in New York City and nominated Victoria C. Woodhull for President of the United States and Frederick Douglass for vice president. In Washington, Douglass received many political honors. President Grant appointed him secretary of the Santo Domingo Commission, which was sent to negotiate a treaty with the island republic for its annexation to the United States. In turn, he held the positions of Counselor of the District of Columbia, Marshal of the District of Columbia, Recorder of Deeds for the District of Columbia, and Minister to Haiti. It was in 1869 that he moved to Washington, and there for a quarter of a century longer he remained unrivaled, the outstanding figure of his race. He was referred to as the Sage of Anacostia. His old homestead, Anacostia, is now a Negro shrine, maintained by the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs. It was restored through the efforts of Mrs. Mary B. Talbert of Buffalo, New York, one-time president of the association. He died in 1895 in his 78th year. 6 months after his death, Booker T. Washington made his famous Atlanta speech, and a new leader suddenly stood before the people. Douglass died, probably a disappointed man. He had lived to see many of the highest hopes for his race fall to the ground. He was a philosopher, but there were many things he saw come to pass that he could hardly have accepted with resignation. He had seen the Negro disenfranchised, and all the guarantees of equal citizenship fought for and laid down for him in the fundamental law of the land flouted. He had seen the race made the victim of new hatreds and brutalities not equaled under some phases of slavery. He had the knowledge that in the 10 years before his death, more than 2,000 of his fellows had been lynched and tortured and burnt at the stake. As long as there are American Negroes, Frederick Douglass will be remembered. But he will be remembered and honored chiefly for the prodigious things he accomplished as a Negro in New York. Chapter 7. In the earliest days, the Negro population of New York lived naturally in and about the city at the tip of Manhattan Island. In the middle of the last century, they lived mainly in the vicinity of Lispenard, Broome, and Spring Streets. When Washington Square was the center of fashionable life, large numbers of Negroes engaged in domestic service in the homes of the rich lived in a fringe of nests to the west and south of the square. As late as 1880, the major portion of the Negro population of the city lived in Sullivan, Bleecker, Thompson, Carmine, and Grove Streets, Monetta Lane, and adjacent streets. It is curious to see that some of these nests still persist, scattered through Greenwich Village and Little Italy. Small groups of Negroes may be found who have never lived in any other part of the city. Negro New York has passed on and left them stranded and isolated. They are vestiges of a generation long gone by. They appear to be content, however, and probably they view with some scorn the new and rather raw Harlem Center. And they have some ground for sectional pride, for they show, perhaps, as large a percentage of New York-born adults as any other section of the city. Mary White Ovington, in a social study that she made, inquired into the places of birth of 1,036 Negro tenement dwellers in the 5 sections of Manhattan where colored people at the time lived. 57% of the adults in the Greenwich Village section who were questioned were born in New York City. Footnote: Mary White Ovington, half a man, Longmans, Green and Company, New York, 1911. End of footnote. By 1890, the center of the colored population had shifted to the upper 20s and lower 30s west of 6th Avenue. 10 years later, another considerable shift northward had been made to West 53rd Street and to San Juan Hill, West 61st, 62nd, and 63rd Streets. For some decades, most of the upper class and well-to-do colored people had lived in Brooklyn. Their exodus from Manhattan had been caused principally by the draft riots. A large number of them owned homes there, and Brooklyn was the center of social life and respectability. I have indicated that during the fourth quarter of the last century, there was a pause in the racial activities of the Negroes in the North. It would be more strictly true to say that there was a change in activities. In New York, the Negro now began to function and express himself on a different plane, in a different sphere, and in a different way he effectively impressed himself upon the city and the country. Within this period, roughly speaking, the Negro in the North emerged and gained national notice in three great professional sports: horse racing, baseball, and prize fighting. He also made a beginning and headway on the theatrical stage. And New York, the New York of the upper 20s and lower 30s west of 6th Avenue, became the nucleus of these changed activities. Horse racing as an American sport reached development first in the South. The Southern landowners and aristocrats had taken up from the English gentry both riding to hounds and racing early in the last century. By the middle of the century, there was local racing on tracks at New Orleans, Mobile, Charleston, Richmond, Nashville, Lexington, and Louisville. The Civil War interrupted the sport, but immediately after the war, it was resumed on a grander scale. Associations were organized, and race meets were scheduled. This tendency culminated in the building of a great track at Louisville and the offering of large prizes. Then was established the Kentucky Derby, the first American racing classic, an event which each year drew the fancy from all over the country. The Southern horse owners, naturally, in fact of necessity, made use of Negro jockeys, trainers, and stable boys. So there grew up a class of Negro horsemen unequaled by any in the land. When the first Kentucky Derby was run, out of the 14 jockeys who rode in the race, 13 were colored. Therefore, when the center of horse racing was shifted to the east and became, somewhat in the English sense, a national sport, Negroes jockeys constituted the very first ranks of the profession. When racing shifted to the east and became also a profitable business venture, with the bookmaker as a recognized factor, the great jockeys jumped into national popularity. In the heyday of racing, the name of the winner of the Futurity, the Suburban, the Realization, the Brooklyn Handicap, the Metropolitan Handicap, or the Saratoga Cup was as widely heralded and almost as widely known as the name of the winner of a present-day championship prize fight. In the days when jockeys were popular idols, none were more popular than the best of the colored ones. No American jockey was ever more popular than Isaac Murphy. All in all, Murphy was the most finished American horseman who ever rode a race. In the Saratoga season of 1882, he won 49 of his 51 races. In the long history of the Kentucky Derby, he is the only jockey that ever rode 3 winners. He rode the winner in 1884, 1890, and 1891. 4 times he rode his mounts to victory in the American Derby in 1884, 1885, 1886, and 1888. There was only one white jockey of his time, Snapper Garrison, who could be mentioned with him. Other famous Negro jockeys were Pike Barnes, Andy Hamilton, Jimmy Winkfield, Willie Sims, Johnny Stovall, Tiny Williams, the 2 Clayton brothers, Soup Perkins, Monk Overton, Link Jones, Bob Isom, Emmanuel Morris, Felix Carr, and Jimmy Lee. To Lee goes the credit for one of the most sensational performances ever carried through by any jockey on any track. At Churchill Downs, Louisville, on June 5th, 1907, he won each of the 6 races on the card. Pike Barnes had the distinction of winning the Futurity, the first time it was run in 1888. His mount was Proctor Knott, on whom he just beat out Andy Hamilton on Salvatore. Willie Sims was one of the best jockeys of all time. In a great degree, the success of the Dwyer stables was due to his horsemanship. Riding abroad under the Croker-Dwyer colors, he was the first non-English jockey to win a race on an English track. Sims was the first American jockey to shorten his stirrups and introduce the monkey on a stick seat, which was afterwards universally adopted. The Negro jockey has today almost entirely passed, but it may be said that horse racing itself, as a popular American sport, has greatly declined. It has fallen into ill repute and under the heels of the reformers. Today, not even the names of white jockeys are widely known. There were several factors in the passing of the Negro jockey, not the least of which was the economic one. When jockeys began to earn $10,000 to $20,000 a year, and even more, forces against the Negro were set in motion and kept at work until he was excluded. The same sort of thing might happen if the pay of the Pullman porters was raised to $300 a month. The record of the Negro in professional baseball makes not so full a page. He did not have so much of a chance in baseball as he had in racing and pugilism. He never gets a fair chance in those forms of sport or athletics where he must be a member of a team, as in those where he may stand upon his own ability as an individual. The difficulty starts with prejudice against his becoming a team member. In baseball, as in racing, the Negro gained his first experience in the South. By 1880, nearly every city and town in the South had its colored baseball club. For a period of years, the best teams in the South were the colored teams. For some reasons, the whites were tardy about taking up the game and becoming proficient at it. In many places, however, they were fierce partisans and strong supporters of the black team of their town. Important match games between rival teams of different towns or states often drew as many white as black rooters and spectators. These were all amateur clubs, but several of them were as good as the professional clubs. Both Nashville and Memphis possessed crack-colored teams. Memphis had a wonderful pitcher named Higgins, and a catcher called Pee Wee Gwynn, who was one of the first catchers in the game to take them off the bat. Nevertheless, in the middle 80s, there were 4 colored players on professional league teams. Rochester signed Higgins, formerly of the Memphis colored team. Jersey City had a famous black battery, Stovey and Walker, and Buffalo had a star second baseman named Grant. Grant was dubbed the Black Dunlap, after Dunlap of Detroit, who was then the most brilliant second baseman in the National League. But the Negro player could not front the forces against him in organized baseball, so he was compelled to organize for himself. The first professional Negro team to be formed was the Gorhams of New York. From the Gorhams came the famous Cuban Giants. Following the success of the Cuban Giants, colored professional and semi-professional clubs called Giants of some kind were organized in a dozen or more cities. These professional clubs have become better organized and now play a regularly scheduled series of games. They play very good ball and are quite popular, especially when they are pitted against white teams, and they are quite frequently in New York. The Cuban Giants were a remarkable aggregation and were widely known. The sports writers gave them much space. They played fastball and demonstrated it in games with league teams. But one of the main reasons why they were such good copy was the fact that they brought something entirely new to the professional diamond. They originated and introduced baseball comedy. The coaches kept up a constant banter that was spontaneous and amusing. They often staged a comic pantomime for the benefit of the spectators. When the team was in the field, the catcher habitually indulged in a continuous monologue in which he counseled and encouraged the pitcher, or got off remarks not wholly complimentary to the batter. Generally, after a good play, the whole team would for a moment cut monkey shines that would make the grandstand and bleachers roar. Delighted crowds went as much to hear as to see the Cuban Giants play ball. This style of baseball never gained much headway in the white professional clubs. Most white players who tried it appeared foolish rather than funny. Arlie Latham of the old St. Louis Browns was a good comedian, and in more recent years, the Washingtons have boasted a pair of splendid pantomimists. But on the whole, baseball in the white professional world, at least, so far as the players were concerned, remained a dignified and rather grim performance. Nor has any other colored club been the equal of the Cuban Giants in baseball comedy, and it is probable that the clubs of today do not wish to be quite their equals. Nevertheless, they all play the game in some degree after the manner of the first great Negro professional team. The Negro's fairest chance in the professional sports came in the prize ring. Here was brought into play more fully than in any other sport the advantageous factor of sole dependence upon his own individual skill and stamina. The prize fighter had an advantage over even the jockey, who might be handicapped by hopeless mounts. The Negro prize fighter, of course, often ran up against the hostility of the crowd, an intangible but, nevertheless, very real handicap. This very antagonism, however, according to the stout-heartedness of the fighter, might serve as a spur to victory. This is what actually happened when George Dixon defended his title of featherweight champion of the world and defeated Jack Skelly at New Orleans in 1892. This was more truly the case when Jack Johnson held his title of heavyweight champion of the world by knocking out Jim Jeffries at Reno, July 4th, 1910. Johnson has said that not only did he have to fight Jeffries, but that psychologically he also had to fight the majority of the thousands of spectators, many of whom were howling and praying for Jeffries to kill the nigger. In truth, Johnson had to do more. On that day, he had to fight psychologically the majority of the population of the United States. Jeffries had been brought forth as, quote, the hope of the white race. Indeed, during Johnson's term of championship and up to his defeat by Willard at Havana in 1915, every white fighter who was being groomed as a heavyweight contender was known as a white hope. A good part of the press and some literary fellows were industrious in fomenting the sentiment that the security of white civilization and white supremacy depended upon the defeat of Jack Johnson. One of these writers assumed the role of both prophet and comforter, and before the Reno battle, wrote in the red-blooded style of the day that Jeffries was bound to win because, while he had Runnymede and Agincourt behind him, the Negro had nothing but the jungle, that the Negro would be licked the moment the white man looked him in the eye. This psychic manifestation of white superiority did not materialize, but that sort of thing did help to create a tenseness of feeling that constituted something real for Jack Johnson to contend with, and furthermore, immediately after the fight, expended itself in the beating up of numerous individual Negroes in various parts of the country as a sort of vicarious obliteration of the blot of Jeffries' defeat, and in a manner not at all in accordance with the Marquis of Queensberry rules. In fact, the reaction was so great that pressure was brought which forced Congress to pass a law prohibiting the interstate exhibition of moving pictures of prize fights, a law which still stands to plague and limit the magnates of pugilism and of the movies. Perhaps it was Jack Johnson's sense of humor, almost as much as his skill and courage, that enabled him to overcome this thing in the air. All through the fight, he kept up a running banter with James J. Corbett, who was in Jeffries' corner. He would say to Corbett, "Watch this one, Jim. How'd you like that?" He relates that once in the midst of the fight, he looked at Corbett's face and had to laugh. He says, "Jim's face reminded me of a man who had tasted his first green olive." The story of the Negro in the prize ring goes back much further than one would think. And curiously, the beginning of the story is laid in New York City. The earliest acknowledgment of any man as champion of America was made about 1809, and that man was Thomas Molyneux, sometimes written as Molyneux. Tom Molyneux was born in 1784, a black slave belonging to a Molyneux family of Virginia. When he was about 20 years old, he came to New York as a freeman and got a job as a porter in the old Catherine Street Market. The precise manner in which he procured his freedom does not seem to be known, but it appears that it was not by running away. Catherine Market was headquarters for Negro boxers, and the newcomer soon proved himself the best of them all. It is more than probable that he did not reach New York a raw novice. There is a tradition that his father and grandfather before him had been boxers down in Virginia. For tradition also had it that boxing as a sport in this country began in Virginia, that in Virginia, more than in any other colony or state, it was the custom for the scions of aristocratic families to be sent to England as a part of their education, to rub shoulders with the gentry of the mother country and get the final polish that was deemed necessary for a southern gentleman, that these young bloods witnessed prize fights in England, where it was then and is now good form for the gentry not only to attend fights, but also to take lessons in the manly art, and brought the sport back home. Then, of course, the only way in which they could continue to enjoy it was to train likely young slaves as boxers and hold contests between the champions of different plantations. It can easily be imagined how much excitement and sport this would afford the rich planters. Molyneux, after he had beaten every worthwhile fighter in America, both the Negroes and the whites, belonging to the crews of British vessels and ports, white Americans had not yet taken up pugilism as a profession, was persuaded by the captain of one of the foreign vessels and ports to go to England and seek a fight with the famed Tom Cribb, champion of England and of the world. He did go, and through the assistance of Bill Richmond, got the match. The fight between Cribb and Molyneux, which took place on December 18th, 1810, at Capthall Common, Sussex, is one of the great prize ring battles of England. Compared with the theatrical performances and business-like transactions of today, it takes on titanic proportions. A reading of the contemporary accounts of the fight gives the impression of an ancient gladiatorial struggle to the death. The records of the time and later English authorities on boxing admit that technically Molyneux won the fight and consequently the championship of the world. He lost the decision through a bit of trickery on the part of Cribb's seconds. At the end of the 28th round, both men were in such a condition that they had to be carried to their corners. When time was called for the 29th round, Cribb was still so exhausted that he was unable to rise and respond. Joe Ward in Cribb's corner maneuvered by immediately engaging Molyneux's seconds in a harangue on some point or other, and thereby gained enough time to enable the champion to recover himself. The fight went on and was won by Cribb in the 40th round. Molyneux at once issued another challenge, and a second fight for the championship of the world was fought on September 28, 1811. In this fight, Molyneux was defeated. In that age, even as today, there were excuses or alibis, and it was asserted that Molyneux lost because up to the time of the fight, he had to go barnstorming about the country in order to make a living, while Cribb underwent the best of training at Captain Barclay's estate in Scotland and was in the finest condition. It is to Molyneux's credit that this excuse was not offered by him. Molyneux fought and won a great many fights in England, Scotland, and Ireland. He lost 2 to Cribb, but the courage and stamina he displayed in both fights with the champion won for him the admiration of the fancy and the British public. He remains today one of the great figures in the history of the English prize ring. Bill Richmond, mentioned above, curiously too furnishes another thread that links this particular phase of our whole story to New York. When Molyneux reached England, he was taken under the patronage of Richmond, who was then one of the rulers in the English pugilistic world. And this same Richmond was a Negro, born a slave on Staten Island, August 5th, 1763. Pierce Egan, the noted contemporary historian of the English prize ring, writing with no undue regard for syntax, says of Richmond, when Staten Island, was taken by the English, young Richmond engaged the attention of General Earl Percy, the present Duke of Northumberland, who took him under his protection as his servant, and after traveling with the Earl abroad for some time, he arrived in England about the year 1777. The Duke, finding Bill to possess a good capacity and being an intelligent youth, had him put in school in Yorkshire, where he received a tolerably good education, and who afterwards apprenticed Richmond to the trade of cabinet maker and followed his business for a considerable time, not only in the above city but in the metropolis, as a journeyman, with credit to himself and respected by his employers. Footnote: quoted in Alexander Johnston, 10 and out, London, Chapman and Hall. End of footnote. Richmond did not remain in the service of Earl Percy. Before he had long been in England, he attached himself to Lord Camelford, a sporting nobleman, and thence got into the prize ring. He never fought in America, but fought and won a good many fights in England. He fought Cribb in 1805, 5 years before Molyneux fought the champion. This was the most amazing boxing exhibition ever staged up to that time. Richmond successfully carried out the plan of not allowing his opponent to hit him, and of not taking any chances in trying to hit his opponent. This dodge and run contest lasted an hour and a half, and ended with the decision being awarded to Cribb. It should be said for Richmond that at the time of this fight he was 42 years old, and Cribb 24. Yet, in this respect, Richmond stands as the marvel of pugilism. Age appears to have had little or no effect upon his ability to fight. After his fight with Cribb, he retired from the ring and became the proprietor of a tavern, the Horse and Dolphin. He continued, however, to be active in the promotion of fights, and often acted as a second. He was Cribb's second when the champion fought Jem Belcher. He prospered as a tavern keeper, and was regarded as a man of intelligence and standing. He became an intimate of the sportsmen of the nobility, among them Lord Byron. Then, as the marvel of pugilism, he came out from retirement in his 52nd year and fought Davis, the navvy, who was then 24 years old, and defeated him in the 13th round by a knockout. The next year he fought Sailor Shelton, then 28 years old, and knocked him out in the 23rd round. At the finish of both these fights, he leaped lightly over the ropes without a scratch on him. Nor was this the end. 2 years later, when he was 55 years old, Richmond was one of a company of gentlemen having a pleasant evening at a respectable tavern in the neighborhood of Chancery Lane. Jack Carter, a successful fighter, known as the Lancashire Hero, intruded and made a nuisance of himself. The company rose and put him out. Carter, angered at this treatment, roared, "Is there men among you who dare face Jack Carter?" Richmond answered the challenge. An impromptu ring was cleared in the yard of the tavern. He knocked Carter out in 3 rounds. He died in 1829, highly respected by all who knew him. Molyneux died a charge upon his friends and charity. Within the United States, the Negro has made a high record in pugilism. In every important division of the sport, since its organized establishment, a Negro has held the championship of the world. In the bantamweight, George Dixon. Featherweight, George Dixon. Lightweight, Joe Gans. Welterweight, Joe Walcott. Middleweight, Tiger Flowers. Light heavyweight, Battling Siki, won in France. Heavyweight, Jack Johnson. In addition to these champions, there is a long list of notable Negro pugilists. There was George Godfrey of the old days in Boston. Then came Peter Jackson, who held the championship of Australia and against whom John L. Sullivan relentlessly drew the color line. Jackson is universally acknowledged as among the greatest of the great fighters. He fought Corbett 61 rounds to a draw in 1891. 1 year later, he fought his famous battle with Frank Slavin before the National Sporting Club of London and defeated him. After that event, his decline as a fighter set in. Peter Jackson was the first example in the United States of a man acting upon the assumption that he could be a prize fighter and at the same time a cultured gentleman. His chivalry in the ring was so great that sports writers down to today apply to him the doubtful compliment, quote, a white colored man. He was very popular in New York. If Jack Johnson had been in demeanor a Peter Jackson, the subsequent story of the Negro in the prize ring would have been somewhat different. Nevertheless, it should be said for Johnson that whatever he may have lacked in behavior and good sense, he was a first-class fighting man, rated in fact the best defensive fighter the American ring has ever seen. During the first decade of the century, there was a trio of formidable Negro heavyweights, Sam Langford, Sam McVeigh, and Joe Jeanette. One of the most sensational fighters in the ring today is Kid Chocolate, Eligio Sardinas, the black Cuban bantamweight. New York, the New York of the upper 20s and the lower 30s, was the business and social center of most of the colored men engaged in these professional sports, as it was also of the genuine blackface minstrels, the forerunners of the later colored performers wherever their work might take them. They homed to New York. And because these men earned and spent large sums of money, there grew up in New York a flourishing black bohemia. Chapter 8. New York's black bohemia constituted a part of the famous old Tenderloin, and naturally it nourished a number of the ever-present vices, chief among them gambling and prostitution. But it nourished other things, and one of these things was artistic effort. It is in the growth of this artistic effort that we are here interested. The rest of the manifestations were commonplaces. This black bohemia had its physical being in a number of clubs, a dozen or more of them well established and well known. There were gambling clubs, honky-tonks, and professional clubs. The gambling clubs need not be explained. The honky-tonks were places with paid and volunteer entertainers where both sexes met to drink, dance, and have a good time. They were the prototype of the modern nightclub. The professional clubs were particularly the rendezvous of the professionals, their satellites and admirers. Several of these clubs were famous in their day and were frequented not only by blacks but also by whites. Among the best known were Joe Stewart's Criterion, the Douglas Club, the Anderson Club, the Waldorf, Johnny Johnson's, Ike Hines', and later, and a little higher up, Baron Wilkins' Little Savoy in West 35th Street. The borderline between the honky-tonks and some of the professional clubs was very thin. One of the latter that stood out as exclusively professional was Ike Hines'. A description of a club, really Ike Hines', is given in the autobiography of an ex-colored man. Footnote: James Weldon Johnson, The Autobiography of an Ex-Colored Man. New York, Alfred A. Knopf, 1927. End of footnote. That will furnish perhaps a fresher picture of these places and the times than anything I might now write. I have already stated that in the basement of the house there was a Chinese restaurant. The Chinaman who kept it did an exceptionally good business, for chop suey was a favorite dish among the frequenters of the place. On the main floor there were two large rooms, a parlor about 30 feet in length, and a large square back room into which the parlor opened. The floor of the parlor was carpeted. Small tables and chairs were arranged about the room. The windows were draped with lace curtains, and the walls were literally covered with photographs or lithographs of every colored man in America who had ever done anything. There were pictures of Frederick Douglass and of Peter Jackson, of all the lesser lights of the prize ring, of all the famous jockeys and the stage celebrities, down to the newest song and dance team. The most of these photographs were autographed, and, in a sense, made a really valuable collection. In the back room there was a piano, and tables were placed round the wall. The floor was bare, and the center was left vacant for singers, dancers, and others who entertained the patrons. In a closet in this room, which jutted out into the hall, the proprietor kept his buffet. There was no open bar, because the place had no liquor license. In this back room the tables were sometimes pushed aside, and the floor given over to general dancing. The front room on the next floor was a sort of private party room. A back room on the same floor contained no furniture, and was devoted to the use of new and ambitious performers. In this room song and dance teams practiced their steps. Acrobatic teams practiced their tumbles, and many other kinds of acts rehearsed their turns. The other rooms of the house were used as sleeping apartments. No gambling was allowed, and the conduct of the place was surprisingly orderly. It was, in short, a center of colored bohemians and sports. Here the great prize fighters were wont to come, the famous jockeys, the noted minstrels, whose names and faces were familiar on every billboard in the country, and these drew a multitude of those who loved to dwell in the shadow of greatness. There were then no organizations giving performances of such order as are now given by several colored companies. That was because no manager could imagine that audiences would pay to see Negro performers in any other role than that of Mississippi River roustabouts. But there was lots of talent and ambition. I often heard the younger and brighter men discussing the time when they would compel the public to recognize that they could do something more than grin and cut pigeon wings. Sometimes one or two of the visiting stage professionals, after being sufficiently urged, would go into the back room and take the places of the regular amateur entertainers, but they were very sparing with their favors, and the patrons regarded them as special treats. There was one man, a minstrel, who, whenever he responded to a request to do something, never essayed anything below a reading from Shakespeare. How well he read I do not know, but he greatly impressed me, and I can say that at least he had a voice which strangely stirred those who heard it. Here was a man who made people laugh at the size of his mouth, while he carried in his heart a burning ambition to be a tragedian. And so after all he did play a part in a tragedy. These notables of the ring, the turf, and the stage drew to the place crowds of admirers, both white and colored. Whenever one of them came in, there were awe-inspired whispers from those who knew him by sight, in which they enlightened those round them as to his identity, and hinted darkly at their great intimacy with the noted one. Those who were on terms of approach showed their privilege by gathering round their divinity. A great deal of money was spent here. So many of the patrons were men who earned large sums. I remember one night a dapper little brown-skinned fellow was pointed out to me, and I was told that he was the most popular jockey of this day, and that he earned $12,000 a year. This latter statement I couldn't doubt, for with my own eyes I saw him spending at about 30 times that rate. For his friends and those who were introduced to him, he bought nothing but wine. In sporting circles, wine means champagne, and paid for it at $5 a quart. This jockey had won a great race that day, and he was rewarding his admirers for the homage they paid him, all of which he accepted with a fine air of condescension. Besides the people I have just been describing, there were at the place almost every night 1 or 2 parties of white people, men and women, who were out sightseeing or slumming. They generally came in cabs. Some of them would stay only for a few minutes, while others sometimes stayed until morning. There was also another set of white people that came frequently. It was made up of variety performers and others who delineated darky characters. They came to get their imitations first-hand from the Negro entertainers they saw there. It was in such places as this that early Negro theatrical talent created for itself a congenial atmosphere, an atmosphere of emulation and guildship. It was also an atmosphere in which new artistic ideas were born and developed. Early Negro theatrical talent, insofar as it was professional, belonged almost entirely to the minstrel stage. Antedating the minstrels, there were attempts made in the drama proper by Negro semi-professionals. As far back as 1821, the African Company gave performances of Othello, Richard III, and other classic plays, interspersed with comic acts, at the African Grove, corner of Bleecker and Mercer Streets, in the rear of the 1 Mile Stone Broadway. The 1 Mile Stone refers to a stone which once stood at the corner of Broadway and Prince Street to mark the distance of 1 mile from City Hall. Later, the company, becoming more prosperous or more ambitious, hired the hotel next door to the Grove for their performances. The New York National Advocate of October 27, 1821, in a facetious notice regarding their efforts, had this to say: "The gentlemen of color announce another play at their Pantheon, corner of Bleecker and Mercer Streets, on Monday evening. They have graciously made a partition at the back of the house for the accommodation of the whites." The National Advocate also states that the attendance of whites out for a lark and causing disorder led to the closing of the theater, but there is proof that it was reopened. Simon Snipe, in a little book entitled Sports of New York, describes a visit to the African Theater which probably took place in the summer of 1823. He describes the theater as well suited for warm weather, the breeze having free access through the crevices of the boards. He says that the orchestra consisted of a violin, a clarinet, and a bass fiddle, played by 2 white men and 1 black. That the audience was composed of white, black, copper-colored, and light brown. The play of the evening was Othello, and he reports in the broadest burlesque manner. Lawrence Hutton, in his Curiosities of the American Stage, reproduces a playbill of the African Company dated June 7th, the year not printed, but it is probable that the year was 1823. Conclusive proof that the African Company was giving performances at least as late as 1823 is furnished by a playbill cited by George C.D. Odell in the Annals of the New York Stage. This bill announces performances for June 20 and 21st, 1823, at the theater in Bleecker Street, in the rear of the 1 Mile Stone, Broadway, and states, "The performers of the African Company have kindly united their services in order to contribute a benefit to their manager, Mr. Brown, who, for the first time, throws himself on the liberality of a generous public. Mr. Brown trusts that his unrelinquished exertions to please will be justly considered by the gentlemen and ladies of this city, as on them depends his future support, and they can declare whether he is to be or not to be. That is the question. Footnote: George C.D. Odell, Annals of the New York Stage, 3, page 70, New York, Columbia University Press, 1928. End of footnote. The prices of admission charged by the African company are interesting in that they seem pretty high for the times and the patrons. The boxes were 75 cents, the pit 50 cents, and the gallery 37.5 cents. At the time of the benefit for Mr. Brown, the prices had been or were lowered to 50 cents for box seats and 25 cents for pit and gallery. In this later period, the public is also called upon to, quote, "Nota bene, proper officers will attend to keep order," end quote. In 1824, there was on Marion Street, near Houston, a place where dramatic plays were given by colored performers. On March 30th, 1826, James Hewlett, one of the original members of the African Company, gave a representation of Shakespeare's Proud Heroes at number 11 Spruce Street. All of this early highbrow theatrical effort could be taken as pathetically ridiculous were it not that out of this same period sprang Ira Aldridge, one of the world's great tragedians. There is great uncertainty about Aldridge's youth. The encyclopedias all give varying accounts of his birth and his life before going on the stage. The Encyclopedia Britannica omits mention of Aldridge. His birthplace is variously given as Bel Air, Maryland, Senegal, Africa, and New York City. The Encyclopedia Americana says of him, Ira Frederick Aldridge, American Negro tragedian. Born, ? Died, Łódź, Poland, August 7th, 1867. The discrepancies about his birth and training are monstrous and indicate invention on one side. One is that he was a mulatto, born near Baltimore about 1810, who picked up German from immigrants, became Edmund Kean's servant, and developed stage talent under him in England, returned and made a theatrical failure in Baltimore, 1830-31, then went back to England and became famous. The other is that he was the son of a full-blooded Negro pastor in New York City, Green Street Chapel, an immigrant Senegal chieftain, converted and educated, who sent his son to Glasgow University to study for the same profession, despite a passion for the stage justified by successful amateur performances. But the boy, at this point the stories coincide, dropped theology and made his debut at the Royal Theatre as Othello. He took at once, and Kean made him Othello to his Iago in Belfast. He played Shakespearean roles in London till 1852, regarded as an excellent interpreter in all, but most liked in color parts, such as Othello, Aaron in Titus Andronicus, Rolla, Zanga, etc. He then played in Brussels and Germany, 1852-55. The King of Sweden invited him to Stockholm in 1857. The Continent ranked him one of the foremost actors of the age and the greatest sovereigns, with cities like Bern, showed honors and decorations on him and made him member of all sorts of learned societies. He married an Englishwoman. He was on his way to an engagement in St. Petersburg when he died. There is extant a still more extraordinary story about Aldridge's birth and youth, namely that Daniel Aldridge, the father of Ira, was the son of a Senegalese king or chief who was brought to this country by missionaries, that 3 days after he left his native land, an insurrection broke out in which his father was overthrown and killed, that Daniel was educated and married in this country, and remained here until he heard of the death of the usurper of his father's place, when he returned with his wife and attempted to regain his hereditary rights, that he met defeat and was obliged to stay in hiding for 9 years, during which time Ira was born. That later he returned to America with the boy to carry out his plans to have him educated for the ministry. There are obvious reasons for doubting the accuracy of this story. There are also obvious reasons why Aldridge himself might not feel inclined to check its circulation or correct it. Such a story must have had a strong appeal to his dramatic imagination. The accounts regarding his birth and early life differ, but, as the Encyclopedia Americana says, from the time of his leaving school, the stories coincide. The writer has had the good fortune to see a photostat copy of one of Ira Aldridge's own scrapbooks, and from it has been able to construct what, in the main, is quite probably the true account of the tragedian's early years. From printed publicity material in the scrapbook, which of course came under the eyes of Aldridge himself, it appears that his father, known as Daniel Aldridge, was the son of a Senegalese chief, and was brought to this country, perhaps first to Maryland, by missionaries to be educated so that he might go back to his people as a Christian ruler. He, quote, was sent for his education to Schenectady College near New York in the United States, end quote. In the meantime, his father was deposed and killed. Daniel, therefore, unable to return to his native land, became the pastor of a colored church, according to this source of information, quote, a minister of the Presbyterian persuasion, and now officiates in Zion Chapel, New York, end quote. The immediately foregoing information is taken from a biographical note in a poster advertising Aldridge's appearance for 10 performances at the Royal Adelphi Theatre, Hull, dated September 1st, 1831. Daniel continued as a preacher in New York until he died, September 27th, 1840, quote, greatly regretted by his colored brethren, end quote. Ira was born July 24th, 1807. It is probable that New York City was the place of his birth, and that it was there his education was begun. Henry Highland Garnett's address, delivered in the House of Representatives, was published, together with a sketch of his life written by Dr. James McCune Smith, a contemporary and a very prominent New York Negro. The sketch states that Garnett was first a pupil of African Free School No. 1 in New York, and mentions as others who had attended the same school and risen to distinction in life: Patrick Reason, the engraver; Samuel Ringgold Ward, the orator; Alexander Crummell, the preacher; and Ira Aldridge, the actor. Dr. Smith, though younger, was of Aldridge's generation, and may as a boy have seen and known him. It also appears that while but a boy, Aldridge made his first appearance on the stage in the character of Rolla, the hero in Sheridan's Pizarro, with an, quote, all-Negro cast at a private theater. This performance, it is most probable, took place in New York City. He got employment of some sort. It may have been as callboy, which took him behind the scenes at the Chatham Theater, where he listened nightly to the actors declaiming their lines. It was with great reluctance that he left this work, which fascinated him, to go on with his education. It is possible that Aldridge, before he was sent to Glasgow, attended for a while the same school to which his father had gone. It seems that he was at Glasgow about a year and a half, but in that time made something of a record for scholarship, winning several prizes and the medal for Latin composition. He then abandoned his studies and went to London, where, after considerable difficulty, he made an appearance as Othello at the Royalty, an East End theater. He made a favorable impression, and from that time on his climb to success was steady. From the royalty, he went to the Coburg and gave performances of Orinoco and other plays. While he was playing at the Coburg, there came a young lady, a member of a private box party, to see his performance. She shortly afterwards became his wife. He went from the Coburg to Sadler's Wells Theatre. He then decided to leave London and go through the study and practice which he, quote, deemed necessary for a sound metropolitan reputation. He made an extended tour of the provinces, playing Brighton, Chichester, Leicester, Liverpool, Manchester, Glasgow, Edinburgh, Exeter, and other towns. He opened at Covent Garden in Othello, April 10th, 1833. Footnote: London Opinion was led to comment upon Ira Aldridge in its issue of March 13, 1915, the occasion being the death of his widow, a second wife, the former Countess Amanda Pauline Brent, at the age of 82. It is there stated that his first appearance in London was with the company of the Victoria Theatre in Waterloo Road. End of footnote. For a long time, he was unable to get an engagement in Dublin because the manager of the theatre could not be induced to engage a Negro actor. Aldridge went to Dublin and had a personal interview with the manager, Mr. Calcraft, and obtained an engagement for a limited period. He opened in Othello and was a sensation. It was during this engagement that Edmund Kean saw his performance, and the result was Kean's Iago to Aldridge's Othello, and an intimate friendship between the two men. Othello was his favorite and most famous role. By playing the role of Aaron, the Moor, in Titus Andronicus, he restored to the English stage a play which, prior to 1851, had not been acted for 2 centuries. The accounts of his professional appearances in the United States are too fragmentary to afford any definite information. Indeed, it seems doubtful that he ever did so appear. In one of the posters in the scrapbook, Messrs. Ingleton and Clifton, announcing his engagement for their theater, referred to, quote, his successes in New York and the principal theaters of the United States, end quote. Most likely this is a reference, exaggerated for publicity purposes, to his successes as a youthful amateur. Aldridge had large success in Great Britain, but it was on the continent that he was first accorded unqualified recognition. It was on the continent that he was most enthusiastically acclaimed. There is a story that one night, after his performance of Othello in St. Petersburg, the students unhitched the horses from his carriage and themselves drew it back to his hotel. He was an intimate friend of Alexandre Dumas. In the correspondence between Richard Wagner and Mathilde Wessendonck, there appears the following note from him to her. Take notice. Wednesday, Othello, Ira Aldridge. Tickets should be booked in time. The top of the morning. R.W. In 1865, the Chevalier Ira Aldridge made his last professional visit to London. It was during this visit that the Desdemona to his Othello at the Haymarket was Mrs. Kendall. This was at the beginning of Mrs. Kendall's great career, and of the engagement she herself wrote. During the time that I was there, Mr. Ira Aldridge was engaged to act. Mr. Ira Aldridge was a man who, being black, always picked out the fairest women he could to play Desdemona with him. not because she was capable of acting the part, but because she had a fair head. One of the great bits of business that he used to do was where in one of the scenes he had to say, "Your hand, Desdemona." He made a very great point of opening his hand and making you place yours in it, and the audience used to see the contrast. He always made a point of it and got a round of applause. How? I do not know. It always struck me that he had some species of, well, I would not say genius, because I dislike that word is used nowadays, but gleams of great intelligence. Although a genuine black, he was quite preux chevalier in his manners to women. Just before his death, Aldridge had about completed arrangements for an American tour. He died in Łódź, Poland, and was given a civic funeral. In December 1928, at the request of the committees organized for the purpose of rebuilding the Shakespeare Memorial Theater at Stratford-on-Avon, I undertook to plan the raising of $1,000 by colored people in the United States for the endowment of an Ira Aldridge memorial chair in the theater. A committee was formed, and the money promptly raised and forwarded through the American Shakespeare Foundation to the Shakespeare Memorial Fund in England. But Ira Aldridge was a sport. His career was in no degree a direct factor in the Negro's theatrical development. In a less degree did the efforts made at the African Grove Theater have any consequent effects. The real beginnings of the Negro in the American theater were made on the minstrel stage. Negro minstrelsy, as a popular form of professional entertainment, seems dead. Nevertheless, its history cannot be reviewed without recognition of the fact that it was the first and remains, up to this time, the only completely original contribution America has made to the theater. Negro minstrelsy, everyone ought to know, had its origin among the slaves of the Old South. Every plantation had its talented band that could crack Negro jokes and sing and dance to the accompaniment of the banjo and the bones. The bones being the actual ribs of a sheep or some other small animal, cut the proper length and scraped clean and bleached in the sun. When the wealthy plantation owner wished to entertain and amuse his guests, he needed only to call for his troupe of black minstrels. There is a record of at least one of these bands that became semi-professional and traveled round from plantation to plantation giving performances. White actors very early realized the commercial value of Negro impersonation, and as far back as the beginning of the 19th century began putting on single blackface acts. The most famous of these singles was Dan Rice's Jump Jim Crow. In the summer of 1830, according to an account in the Atlantic Monthly of November 1867, Rice, then an obscure performer, was sauntering through the streets of Cincinnati when he heard a ragged Negro singing the Jump Jim Crow song. The idea at once struck him that with the song and the impersonation he could make a hit. He put the act on in the fall of Pittsburgh and did make a hit. Indeed, Jump Jim Crow made Dan Rice famous. Later, during an engagement in Washington, Rice made the act a double, his partner being Joseph Jefferson, then about 4 years old. Rice brought him in on a sack slung over his shoulder and, stepping down to the footlights, sang, "Ladies and gentlemen, I'd have you for to know that I've got a little darky here that jumps Jim Crow." With which he emptied little Jefferson from the sack, made up, rags, blackface and all, as a diminutive and imitating counterpart. This was Joseph Jefferson's debut on the stage, the first black-faced minstrel troupe to give a worked-up performance in a regular theater was a quartet of white men headed by Dan Emmett, the man who wrote Dixie. They called themselves the Virginia Minstrels and opened in New York City during the first part of February 1843. Almost simultaneously, troops sprang up in the larger northern cities, and Negro minstrelsy was at once on its way to the great popularity it was to hold for more than 60 years. These troops took such names as Virginia Serenaders, Ethiopian Minstrels, and Kentucky Minstrels. Later troops bore the names of their organizers or managers. Minstrelsy flourished, and it was developed and elaborated to such a degree that it became less and less an imitation of Negro plantation life, and toward the end of the last century it provided the most gorgeous stage spectacle to be seen in the United States. All of these companies did not remain entirely white. The most notable exception was the troupe taken out by Primrose and West in 1893, known as, quote, the 40 Whites and 30 Blacks. The full entry of the Negro himself upon the professional minstrel stage took place toward the end of the 60s, although Lew Johnson's Plantation Minstrel Company was organized during the early part of the decade. These troupes, composed of Negroes, accepted almost wholly the performance pattern as it had been worked out and laid down by the white minstrels during the preceding 25 years, even to blackening their faces, an expedient which, of course, never entered the minds of the original plantation artists. However, these performers could not help bringing to professional minstrelsy something fresh and original. They brought a great deal that was new in dancing, by exhibiting in their perfection the jig, the buck and wing, and the tantalizing stop-time dances. Billy Cursands, the most famous of all the genuine Negro minstrels, introduced the Virginia essence, which constituted one of the fundamental steps in Negro dancing. One of the specialties of the two Bohe brothers was a soft shoe dance in the calcium light, while they sang and accompanied themselves on their banjos. And it appears that the creator of the minstrel and vaudeville monologue was Charles Crusoe, a Negro minstrel of the early 70s who was billed as, quote, the man who talks. Wallace King and Billy Windham, two of the most famous of minstrel tenors, did a great deal to give a certain style of singing popularity. King made clever use of falsetto, as did Windham, who was billed as, quote, the singer with the child voice. The first successful all-Negro company was the Georgia Minstrels, organized in 1865 by Charles Hicks, a Negro. Hicks found the hostility to doing business with a colored manager too great a handicap, so after 2 or 3 seasons of ups and downs, the management was taken over by Charles Callender, and the company became known as Callender's Original Georgia Minstrels. It was headed by Billy Cursands. A little later, Sam Lucas was added to the list. Sam Lucas came to be the grand old man of the Negro stage. He was born in Washington, Ohio, in 1840, was well educated, cultured in his manners, and a neat dresser. He was the sort of man that looks well in a frock coat. He was a versatile performer and was active on stage from those early days of minstrelsy down to modern Negro musical comedy. As late as 1910, he played a leading part in Cole and Johnson's Red Moon. In 1915, he played the role of Uncle Tom in the first screen version of Uncle Tom's Cabin, himself making the plunge into the river to save little Eva. His friends felt that this feature of his performance helped to bring on his fatal illness. He died in New York, January 10th, 1916. In addition to these qualities, Sam Lucas possessed another valuable attribute as an actor, especially for those times. Daniel Frohman and Isaac Marcusson, in their Life of Charles Frohman, relate that Gustav Frohman started as advance agent with the Calendar Minstrels in August 1872, that later he became manager of the show and secured the place of advance agent for his brother Daniel, that at the close of 1876, Gustav Frohman quit the Calendar Minstrels, and he and George Stoddard launched the Stoddard Comedy Company with John Dillon as star. He gave his brother Charles the job of advance agent. The show played in terrible luck and was several times on the verge of stranding, in spite of the heroic efforts of the youthful and enthusiastic Charles. The company, by hook or by crook, worked its way up through Texas, Arkansas, and Tennessee to Richmond, Kentucky. The biographers of Mr. Frohman then go on to say, "At Richmond, Gustav had an inspiration. Then, as always, Uncle Tom's Cabin was the great lifesaver of the harassed and needy theatrical organization. Why not have a real Negro play Uncle Tom?" said Gustav. So he wired Charles as follows, quote, "Get me an Eva and send her down with Sam Lucas. Be sure to tell Sam to bring his diamonds." End quote. Sam Lucas was a famous Negro minstrel who had been with the Calendar Company. He sported a collection of diamonds that made him the envy and admiration of his colleagues. Gustav knew that these jewels, like Louise Dillon's sealskin sack, meant a meal ticket for the company and transportation in an emergency. Charles engaged Sally Cohen, now Mrs. John C. Rice, and sent her down with Lucas, who, by the way, provided the money for the trip. Gustav Frohman had visions of big business in Ohio, but Uncle Tom couldn't save them, and Wilmington, Ohio, quote, proved to be the last despairing gasp of the Stoddard Comedy Company, for the trouble-studded tour now ended. Some of Lucas's diamonds were pawned to get the company back to Cincinnati. End quote. In 1878, Jack Haverly bought the Calendar Minstrels. Gustav Frohman was again the manager for a while and took the troupe on a tour to the Pacific coast. The Calendar Company, 2 or 3 years later, went to Europe under the name of Haverly's European Minstrels. In the company were Billy Kersans, Sam Lucas, James Bland, Billy Speed, Irving Sales, Tom McIntosh, and the Bohe brothers. The three Frohmans had in the meantime taken over the Madison Square Theater in New York, but Gustav Frohman conceived the plan of getting together the largest Negro minstrel company ever organized and making a grand tour of the United States. In June 1882, he sent his brother Charles to England to get, if possible, the pick of Haverly's Europeans, then playing there. Charles Frohman accomplished his errand by purchasing the whole company from Haverly and bringing it back to the United States. There was then put on the road Calendar's Consolidated Spectacular Colored Minstrels. On all the bills appeared the inscription, quote, Gustav and Charles Frohman, proprietors, end quote. Charles Frohman brought back the whole company with the exception of the Bohe brothers and 1 or 2 others. The 2 Bohe brothers were, perhaps, the first finished performers on the banjo. They were very popular, especially in England, and one of them, James, never came back. They were successful both as performers and as teachers. James Bohey was instructor on the banjo to the then Prince of Wales. In the palmy days of minstrelsy, the 80s and 90s, besides several lesser troupes, there were 3 large, well-known Negro companies that bore the names of their colored managers and owners. These were the Hicks and Sawyer Minstrels, the same Hicks as he of the Georgia Minstrels, the Richards and Pringle Minstrels, and the McCabe and Young Minstrels. Minstrelsy was, on the whole, a caricature of Negro life, and it fixed a stage tradition which has not yet been entirely broken. It fixed the tradition of the Negro as only an irresponsible, happy-go-lucky, wide-grinning, loud-laughing, shuffling, banjo-playing, singing, dancing sort of being. Nevertheless, these companies did provide stage training and theatrical experience for a large number of colored men. They provided an essential training and theatrical experience which at the time could not have been acquired from any other source. Many of these men, as the vogue of minstrelsy waned, passed on into the second phase or middle period of the Negro on the theatrical stage in America, and it was mainly upon the training they had gained that this